The courtroom was silent, except for the faint scratching of pens on paper. Everyone's eyes were on the maid who sat nervously at the defense table, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn handbag. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in front of a judge, not facing accusations she barely understood. She had spent her life cleaning other people's homes, raising their children, and working endless hours just to make sure her own daughter could have a better life. But today, her whole world seemed ready to collapse. What no one expected was that the one person who would rise to defend her wasn't a famous lawyer, but her own daughter, the girl everyone thought was just a maid's child. The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp and heavy. He was used to seasoned attorneys standing before him, not a young woman barely in her 20s. The daughter, however, stood tall, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. She had grown up watching her mother work tirelessly, facing humiliation and sacrifice in silence. And now, when her mother's dignity and freedom were on the line, she refused to let her stand alone. The entire courtroom whispered in disbelief when the girl declared, "I'm my mom's lawyer." At first, people laughed under their breath. How could a maid's daughter possibly go up against trained professionals? But soon they would realize this young woman had something no one in the room had counted on: a sharp mind, a fearless heart, and a determination born out of love. The prosecution was confident. They thought this was going to be easy, that the maid would crumble under pressure and her daughter would be silenced by legal jargon she couldn't possibly understand. But with every question asked, every argument thrown at her, the daughter surprised them. She used her words like armor, cutting through intimidation with clarity and confidence. It wasn't just about laws for her, it was about justice, about standing up for the woman who had given up everything so she could stand in this very moment. The judge, at first stern and skeptical, soon found himself listening more closely, intrigued by the girl's calm logic and bold challenges. He wasn't used to being shocked, but this young woman was beginning to do just that. Still, the stakes couldn't be higher. The maid's future depended on her daughter's ability to outsmart people far more experienced and powerful. And though the daughter was brilliant, her path was far from easy. The prosecution grew harsher, throwing in evidence meant to break her down. The room grew tense with every passing moment, as everyone wondered, could she really win? Could love, determination, and sheer courage outweigh years of legal experience? The daughter never wavered, but behind her strength was fear. She knew one wrong move could cost her mother everything. As the judge adjusted his glasses and prepared to deliver his next words, the room fell into complete silence. The maid's daughter had said something so unexpected, so powerful, that even the most hardened faces in the courtroom froze. What she revealed next would not only shock the judge but change the course of the entire case. And at that very moment, everyone leaned forward, waiting to hear what would come out of her mouth next. The girl's words still lingered in the air, and for a long moment no one spoke. The judge's brow furrowed as he studied her, as if trying to decide whether this was boldness or foolishness. The daughter didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, even though inside she could feel the weight of every stare in the courtroom pressing down on her. For her, this wasn't just a case. This was her mother's life, her dignity, her everything. And if that meant standing against the odds, then she was ready. The story of how they had come to this moment was just as important as what was unfolding. Her mother had spent decades working in homes that were never her own. Every morning, she would leave before sunrise, carrying with her the quiet strength of someone who had no choice but to keep going. She cooked, cleaned, and cared for families who often looked right past her. Some treated her kindly, others treated her like she was invisible. But she endured it all because she had a dream. Her daughter would never have to live the same life. She believed education was the only way out, and though money was always short, she saved every coin to make sure her child could study. The daughter had grown up in the shadows of wealthy homes, watching children her age enjoy luxuries she couldn't even imagine. But while others had toys and tutors, she had something far more valuable: a mother who never gave up on her. She learned early on that life wasn't fair, but her mother's sacrifices planted in her a fire that wouldn't burn out. Books became her escape, her shield, and her weapon. She studied late into the night, sometimes under a dim bulb in a tiny one-room apartment. Her mother silently stitching clothes beside her to earn a little more for the next day's fees. No one noticed the maid's daughter then. She blended into the background. Just another face people overlooked. But as she grew older, something inside her shifted. She saw how often her mother was disrespected, how people assumed she had no voice, no power. And she promised herself that one day, she would change that. What no one expected was how quickly that promise would be tested. The case that brought them into the courtroom was full of twists. Accusations had been made against her mother. Accusations that could destroy not just her livelihood but her reputation. The prosecution painted her as someone dishonest, someone unworthy of trust. The daughter knew better. She knew every hour her mother had worked, every sacrifice she had made. But proving that to a judge who had heard countless stories before was another challenge altogether. The judge's silence was heavy as he waited for her to continue. The lawyers on the other side smirked, convinced that sooner or later she would stumble. To them, she was just a maid's daughter pretending to belong in a place reserved for professionals. But the young woman had something none of them had counted on. She had lived the very life they were questioning, and she understood truths that couldn't be learned in classrooms. Still, doubt hung in the air. Would passion and determination be enough against polished arguments and legal strategies? The daughter's next words, her next move, would decide everything. She glanced at her mother, who sat silently, her eyes filled with both fear and faith. That look gave her strength. She turned back toward the judge, ready to reveal something that no one in the room could have predicted. And just as the tension reached its breaking point, the young woman opened her mouth again, leaving the entire courtroom bracing for what she was about to say. The young woman's voice carried through the room, steady and clear, but beneath it was a storm of emotion. She began to question the evidence, pointing out details others had overlooked. Every word she spoke peeled back another layer of the prosecution's case, and suddenly their confidence didn't seem so unshakable. The daughter wasn't just defending her mother. She was dismantling the narrative that had been carefully built against her. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his eyes stayed fixed on her as if weighing every word. The main conflict of the case was more than just whether her mother had done something wrong. It was about power. The people accusing her mother were influential, respected, and had the resources to push their story forward. For them, this case wasn't personal. It was paperwork, procedure, and another victory in their career. But for the maid's daughter, it was life itself. She knew she wasn't only fighting against lawyers. She was fighting against a system that too often dismissed people like her mother, people whose voices were never heard. There were whispers in the gallery. Some spectators admired her courage, while others shook their heads, convinced she was wasting everyone's time. Among them sat a man who had known her mother for years, a neighbor who had quietly helped them when times were hardest. His eyes glistened with pride as he watched the girl stand tall. In another corner, a woman who once employed the maid watched nervously, hoping her own past behavior toward her would never be dragged into the light. These silent observers were subplots of their own, people connected to the story, people whose lives had crossed paths with the maid in ways no one in the courtroom knew. Meanwhile, the prosecution grew restless. They adjusted their files, whispered among themselves, and tried to regain control. They reminded the court of their evidence, repeating claims that painted the maid as untrustworthy. But with every argument, the daughter pushed back. She used examples, real-life experiences, and even personal memories to counter them. Each statement carried a weight that no textbook could provide, and for the first time, the prosecution looked unsettled. The judge, though silent, was far from passive. He tapped his pen, occasionally raised an eyebrow, and at moments even allowed the faintest hint of surprise to cross his face. He wasn't used to someone so young holding her ground with such force, and certainly not someone who came from a background the court usually overlooked. Still, his role was not to take sides but to measure truth. And though he gave nothing away, it was clear he was paying close attention. As the tension deepened, The daughter's mind raced with another thought. How far would the opposition go to win? She could sense they were holding back, waiting for the right moment to release their strongest weapon. The fear of what might come next gnawed at her, but she refused to let it show. For her mother, she would stand unshaken. The courtroom seemed to shrink as the conflict grew sharper. Every breath, every movement was heavy with suspense. And though the daughter's courage had begun to shift the balance, the outcome was still uncertain. Somewhere in the pile of files the prosecution guarded so carefully lay a truth that could either save her mother, or destroy everything. And as the judge cleared his throat and asked for the prosecution to present their next piece of evidence, the air grew even colder. Everyone leaned forward, bracing for the revelation that could turn the entire case upside down. The prosecutor rose slowly, a confident smile playing at the corner of his lips. He carried a folder as though it were a weapon, the kind of evidence that could shatter the defense in seconds. The daughter felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to stay composed. She knew this was the moment they had been holding back, the moment they would try to crush her with something she hadn't seen coming. Her mother clasped her hands together, eyes closed, whispering a silent prayer. The courtroom grew still, every sound swallowed by the tension. The prosecutor began to speak, his tone sharp, almost mocking. He laid out what he claimed was undeniable proof against the maid, painting her as dishonest and unworthy of sympathy. He spoke of documents, witnesses, and timelines meant to trap her. As each point landed, the weight of the accusations grew heavier, and for a moment it seemed the tide had turned. Murmurs rippled across the courtroom, people nodding as if convinced the case was already over. But the maid's daughter didn't move. She listened carefully, every word sinking in, her mind working quickly to find cracks in the story. She could feel the judge watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. She knew this was the test that would define everything. She had prepared for sleepless nights like this, had studied cases and laws while others underestimated her. And now, in this moment, all of that came rushing back. Still, doubt pressed against her like a storm. What if she missed something? What if the prosecution truly had the upper hand? The thought of her mother being led away, of her sacrifices ending in shame, almost made her falter. But then she looked at her mother's face, lined with years of struggle, yet filled with unwavering trust. That look gave her strength she didn't know she still had. The judge called for her response, and the room held its breath. She stepped forward, clutching her notes, but she didn't just rely on paper. Her voice carried emotion, conviction, and something more powerful than polished arguments: truth. She began to challenge the evidence piece by piece, pointing out inconsistencies the prosecution hadn't expected her to see. Each time she struck, the prosecutor's smirk faded a little more. The gallery leaned in, realizing they weren't watching a child pretending to be a lawyer. They were witnessing someone who had turned her pain into power. The tension grew unbearable. The judge adjusted his glasses, visibly intrigued. The prosecution scrambled to recover, throwing out harsher questions, trying to trip her into mistakes. But the daughter held steady, her answers sharper with every attack. What began as laughter at her bold claim, "I'm my mom's lawyer," had transformed into stunned silence. People in the room were no longer sure who had the upper hand. As the back and forth reached its peak, the prosecutor prepared to reveal one final piece of evidence, something he believed would corner her completely. The daughter braced herself, her heart racing, knowing the next few minutes would decide everything. The judge leaned forward, the gallery held its breath, and the maid gripped her seat with trembling hands. The moment had arrived where the truth would either break them, or turn the entire case on its head. The prosecutor straightened his shoulders, his expression cold and triumphant, as he pulled out a sealed envelope from the folder. He announced that inside was testimony from a witness who claimed to have seen the maid involved in something dishonest. Gasps filled the room, and for a brief second, it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath the daughter's feet. A new witness. She had pored over every document, studied every name connected to the case, and nowhere had this witness appeared. It was a curveball, a second twist that no one, especially not her, saw coming. The judge allowed the envelope to be opened, and the statement was read aloud. The voice of the clerk echoed through the courtroom, repeating words that painted her mother as guilty. Each sentence was like a knife, cutting through the fragile sense of hope that had just begun to form. The maid lowered her head, shame washing over her face, while the daughter's eyes widened with disbelief. She knew her mother. She knew the life she had lived, the truth she carried, and there was no way these accusations could be real. Yet here it was, written in black and white. Whispers filled the gallery. Some shook their heads as if convinced the case was already sealed. Others glanced at the daughter, curious to see whether she would break under the weight of this new evidence. Even the prosecution seemed to savor the moment, their confidence returning with each murmur of doubt that spread across the room. But the daughter refused to crumble. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her mind racing. She reminded herself that unexpected moves like this often meant something was hidden. Why had this witness only appeared now? Why had their testimony been introduced so late? The timing was too perfect, too strategic. And though fear pulsed through her veins, another part of her sparked with determination. If there was a hidden agenda here, she would find it. The judge turned to her, asking for her response. She took a deep breath, stepping forward with steady steps that betrayed none of the turmoil inside her. Instead of denying outright, she began to ask questions about the credibility of the witness, the gaps in their story, and the sudden timing of their appearance. Her voice, calm but sharp, began to chip away at the cracks in the statement. The gallery leaned in, surprised again by her composure. And then, just as the tension reached another peak, she hinted at something that sent a ripple through the room. She suggested that the so-called witness might not only be unreliable but connected to someone with far more to gain from her mother's downfall. The words hung heavy in the air, leaving everyone stunned. The prosecutor's face tightened, and for the first time, it looked as though he had something to hide. The judge narrowed his eyes, his curiosity clearly piqued. The gallery buzzed with speculation, and the maid lifted her gaze to her daughter with renewed hope. The stakes had just risen higher than anyone expected. This wasn't only about defending her mother anymore. Now it seemed there was a deeper scheme at play, a hidden hand pulling strings behind the accusations. And as the daughter prepared to press further, the courtroom braced itself, knowing that what came next could shake more than just the case. It could shake the very foundation of trust in the room. The tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point. The daughter stood firm, her voice steady as she questioned the sudden appearance of the witness. The prosecutor objected, but the judge silenced him, insisting that the young woman be heard. Everyone leaned forward as she laid out her reasoning step by step, pointing out the contradictions in the testimony and the suspicious timing of its arrival. With each word, her confidence grew, and the once doubtful murmurs of the gallery began to shift into whispers of support. Finally, she revealed what she had uncovered during her late-night study sessions. The so-called witness had been connected to the very family her mother had once worked for, a family who had long resented her for leaving their service and daring to demand fair treatment. The statement wasn't just suspicious. It was planted, crafted to destroy her mother's reputation and silence her. The prosecutor's face drained of color as she presented documents proving the connection, exposing the truth for all to see. The judge's gavel came down hard against the bench, calling for order as gasps and shocked exclamations erupted from the gallery. The maid's daughter had done more than defend her mother. She had revealed a hidden plot that turned the entire case on its head. The judge, his voice grave yet tinged with admiration, declared that the testimony was unreliable and struck it from the record. The accusations against the maid collapsed like a house of cards, leaving nothing solid behind them. The courtroom erupted again, but this time in awe. The young woman had not only stood up to trained lawyers but had dismantled them with precision and heart. The judge turned to her, acknowledging her brilliance and even remarking that she argued with the skill of someone far beyond her years. Her mother wept quietly, tears of relief and pride streaming down her face as she finally saw justice being served. Yet just as the room began to settle, the judge leaned forward and delivered one last twist. He revealed that, while reviewing the case, he had discovered something unusual. The young woman had applied to law school months earlier but had been rejected, not for lack of talent, but because of a clerical error and a letter of influence from the very family now exposed in court. They had tried to block her future before it even began. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the room. The judge then looked at her with a rare softness in his eyes. "You may not hold the title of lawyer yet," he said, "but today you proved you already are one." His words silenced the room, leaving only the sound of her mother's quiet sobs of joy. The conflict was resolved, justice had been served, and the maid's name was cleared. But the final twist left everyone realizing this was only the beginning for the daughter who had shocked the court with her legal genius. Her fight wasn't just for her mother anymore. It was a fight that promised to change everything about her own future. The courtroom slowly emptied after the gavel struck for the final time, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered in every corner. People who had come expecting to see a maid humiliated left instead with whispers of admiration for her daughter's brilliance. Strangers stopped to glance back at them, some with nods of respect, others still in disbelief that the girl they once dismissed as just the maid's daughter had stood toe-to-toe with seasoned lawyers and revealed a hidden truth. For the mother, who had spent a lifetime being overlooked, this moment was almost too overwhelming to take in. She held her daughter's hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. Her tears now a mixture of relief, pride, and gratitude. The judge's revelation about the law school rejection had unlocked something more than a victory in court. It had exposed the quiet injustice that had tried to close doors on her daughter's future. The family who orchestrated it all had been publicly named, their attempt at manipulation laid bare before the world. They left the courtroom that day with their heads lowered, their power diminished, while the maid and her daughter left with their dignity restored. Outside, reporters gathered quickly, cameras flashing, questions being shouted. The daughter, though caught off guard, spoke with the same calm determination she had shown inside. She didn't boast about her win, nor did she speak with anger. Instead, she spoke about justice, about how truth and perseverance matter more than power and influence. She reminded everyone listening that her mother was more than the label of a maid, and that people's worth should never be measured by the work they do but by the sacrifices they make and the lives they touch. Her words struck deeply, turning the story from just a legal battle into something larger, a message of resilience and courage. The neighbor who had quietly watched from the gallery approached them later, pressing an old envelope into the daughter's hands. Inside was a small sum of money he had saved, saying he wanted to contribute to her dream of studying law. Others followed with offers of mentorship, support, and even scholarships. What had once seemed impossible was now within reach, not because of wealth or privilege, but because she had proven herself when it mattered most. Her mother, though still shaken, finally allowed herself to smile. She looked at her daughter and whispered that all the years of sacrifice had been worth it, that the nights she spent sewing by candlelight, the endless hours scrubbing floors, had led to this moment. The daughter held her close, knowing that their bond had always been their greatest strength. As they walked away from the courthouse, the weight they had carried for so long seemed to lift. They weren't just leaving behind a trial, they were stepping into a new beginning. The maid was no longer just a servant in other people's homes. She was the mother of a young woman who had proven herself in front of a judge, who had shocked everyone with her legal genius, and who was now destined to become the lawyer she had always dreamed of being. The story closed not with defeat but with hope, leaving behind a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't about titles, wealth, or connections. It was about courage, love, and the determination to fight for what is right. The maid's daughter had shown that even the most underestimated voice can rise, and when it does, it can change everything.